My name is Camilla Nielsen, and I'm the director of the film President. We are very excited about releasing our film in Japan. This is my second film in Zimbabwe. Before that I made a film called Democrats. And in a funny way, Democrats is actually the reason we made President. I first came to Zimbabwe in 2009, which was the year after the country had had a very bloody election, 2008. There was a need to fix the post-election situation politically, and the international community, together with South Africa, had proposed that Zimbabwe wrote a democratic constitution that tried to limit the power of then President Robert Mugabe and guarantee basic human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, in short, to create a constitutional democracy.
Democracy in Africa, it's a difficult proposition.
Everywhere you are afraid.
You could be killed.
If I say the wrong thing, I might end up behind bars.
The purpose for my first film back in 2009 was to document this historical process that Zimbabwe was going to have a democratic constitution. I come from a country in Denmark where we wrote our constitution hundreds of years ago, and there are no records, no recollections about how that law of the land came to be. The reason I came to Zimbabwe, being a non-Zimbabwean Danish citizen, was that the Danish government had supported the constitution-making process financially. One, and two, because the two parts that was going to write the constitution, the opposition, who wanted a democratic constitution, and Mugabe's party, ZANU-PF, who didn't really want democracy in Zimbabwe, were fighting a lot about this document. So both sides agreed that it would be nice to have a neutral person to document the event. And I became that neutral person. I was the observer. Also, I'm an observational filmmaker. I don't do interviews, I don't do journalistic work in that sense. I don't have an agenda politically with the work that I do. And I'm trained as an anthropologist, and I studied law, so I guess it was felt that I had the right background to tell the story about the constitution-making process. I always wanted to do filmmaking, to study filmmaking, and there's a field called visual anthropology, and I watched a lot of visual anthropological films. I watched a lot of observational work. I went to film school in the US at NYU, so I watched and was deeply inspired by Frederick Wiseman and Albert Maysles and their work and how they told stories. And I felt that the non-journalistic approach to storytelling was a much more, how can I say, perhaps peaceful or perhaps complex way of telling stories.
They want to create a so that it should be like there is a problem in Zimbabwe. We are not doing any problem, we are just demonstrating peacefully. Those police people that
Zimbabwe is a country with very little press freedom. After spending 5 years making Democrats, unfortunately then President Robert Mugabe and his censorship board decided to ban the film. And it was a very harsh ban. It was labeled not suitable for showing to the public, which is a banning category that's the equivalent of X-rated, so almost like as if it was pornography, which is quite hilarious for a film about writing a democratic constitution. There's very little kissing in that film. Here we have a new democratic constitution. In it, there's a chapter on freedom of speech, And the first thing the president does after the movie is out is to ban the film about the making of the democratic constitution. And the two Zimbabwean lawyers I had worked with for 3 years said, let's test this in the Zimbabwean courts. And they fought for almost 3 years before we got a hearing in courts. I had been banned also to travel to Zimbabwe in that period. 2 months before we finally got the day in court, Robert Mugabe had been removed from power in a military coup. And I think the regime at that time and the new Zimbabwean president was very eager to create a democratic veneer about the new Zimbabwe. And part of this new democratic Zimbabwe was, of course, that we don't ban movies. So we went to court, they lifted the ban. So we were all very excited, and we went for dinner in Harare, the capital of Zimbabwe. And it was during that dinner that the protagonist of Democrats said to me, look, we didn't have a happy end to the Democrat story. We fought a 3-year battle. You are now off the banning list. You can re-enter the country. Why don't you come back and film in a couple of months when we have our first post-Mugabe presidential election? It's the first time since 1980, since independence, that dictator Robert Mugabe will not be on the ballot. Please come and tell our story, and I'm sure you'll have a happy end. And I accepted, and that became President, the film.
Oma, we're at war. We're dealing with criminals.
Hey, let's go.
So this is a democracy.
This is a coup.
It's a coup. Yeah, it's a coup.
This is a coup.
When we came to Zimbabwe to make president, Zimbabwe had been ruled by former dictator President Robert Mugabe for almost 40 years. And there was a lot of hope in the country for change. The years under Mugabe's rule was not happy days. And especially for the young people, they really wanted change. They wanted to create a different Zimbabwe. So there was a lot of hope. But having a history of rigged elections in Zimbabwe previously, and having an electoral commission that also has a history of not being independent but doing what the ruling party tells them to do, being under control of the ruling party, of course there was fear and worry that this election could also be stolen. But for the first time in about 2 decades, foreign election observers had been allowed and admitted into the country for this election. There was, I think, election teams from 40 different nations, with a large presence also of EU observers and American observers, to make sure that this election was free and fair. So I think there was some sort of hope that this time it would be a free and fair election. I think also there was hope that after 40 years of rule with Mugabe, that it was time for real change. Many people were wishing for a true constitutional democracy to happen. And Chamisa's hope was to win the election and build a new democracy in Zimbabwe. When I was filming Democrats, Chamisa was a very young minister in Zimbabwe. I didn't know him well, but when Changarai, the former opposition leader, who was opposition leader when I made Democrats, when he passed away from colon cancer just a few months before the election, he was the natural choice as the new leader of opposition, and he stepped up to the plate. And so I approached him and said, look, we're discussing making a film about the election. Would you be interested in us still doing the project? And it took him 5 seconds. He had seen Democrats 6 times, I believe, and was a fan, and he said, sure, I would love to. When can you come? And so I came back very shortly after, and thought I could start filming right away. But unfortunately, the people in the Ministry of Information did not agree that I should come back and make a second film. So I spent about 2 months in Zimbabwe trying to get a film permit to make president, and it was a lot of struggle to get this permit, which we finally got in the very last minute. So in fact, we didn't start filming president till about 4 weeks before election date.
What we have done is to say to people, you have a right in the Constitution. The right is to express yourself.
It's not a mistake, it's not an accident, it's not a hazard to have democratic vent pipes. That's the normal course of things. That's why an engine does have an exhaust pipe, so that when there's combustion, there's an outlet. That Section 59 is to enforce the right of the people to determine the course of events. If they're not happy, they must express themselves. The police are servants of the people, and the people have outsourced their power to the police, to the various state organs, including ZEC. So when they say we want those powers back in order for us to correct a malady in the course of events, it should not be seen as inciting. It should not be seen as a case. It's a blessing that we have such an avenue where people can express themselves peacefully. Why should we be so scared of peace? Why should we be so afraid of peace?
I had built a lot of trust over those 8-10 years, and so when I came back to Zimbabwe, that trust was still there. They knew that I was on their side. They knew that I wouldn't leak stuff to foreign media. And I think Chamisa, just like the other two main characters, perhaps tested me a little bit in the beginning and find out that I wasn't leaking any political secrets from his party. Basically, he said, "What do you need?" And I said, "I need to film everything." And he said, "Okay, let's try." And I think, you know, as a young opposition candidate, knowing media, having seen Democrats, he basically gave us sort of free range to be in meetings, in strategy meetings as well, which is very rare, I think, when you film politics in the middle of a presidential election, that you're allowed to sit in on, you know, how do we do this? So it was a very, very, how can I say, generous environment for us to film in. He's a great character, if you can talk about Chamisa as a character. He's very lively. He throws a lot of one-liners. He's very energetic. And the people loves him. And he was very busy with the campaign because he became leader of the opposition just a few months before the election. So he wasn't prepared. He had to build a campaign. He had to let the Zimbabwean people know who he was with very little time. So he got up at 4 in the morning and worked till after midnight. And of course we had to do the same to follow his every move and not to miss important moments. So in a country like Zimbabwe, there's a lot of surveillance, there's a lot of spies, there's a lot of moles, there's a lot of infiltration. And I think the most important thing for me as a filmmaker was to stay on the trust side of Chamisa and keep the doors open. And even if we knew that I was also under surveillance, having made Democrats and been sort of a known filmmaker by the regime, it was very important for me not to be in the way of Chamisa's political moves and success, but at the same time stay close all the time so we didn't miss important moments. So I'd say for me the most important thing was to keep our trust and our connection intact in a very hectic filming environment. Hectic in the sense that it's a dictatorship that doesn't really want us there, but also hectic as in any presidential campaign. If you can imagine being close to a presidential candidate where everything is at stake, you have to make decisions on the spot. Does the film crew come? Do they stay out? I think just to keep the flow going and make sure that our camera captured all the moments, because it's very difficult to foresee when something happens that's important to the story. So we try to be there all the time, and he generously let us film everything. I think there was a few situations, we had a sign, him and I. Obviously filming in a country like Zimbabwe, there's a lot of issues about security, putting people at risk. People who are lower in the hierarchy than the presidential candidate are often more at risk than he was. So there were a few situations where names were mentioned where we couldn't film for their safety. And so Chamisa and I had an agreement that if he made this sign silently, we would switch off the cameras and switch off the sound, but not leave the room. That was very important for me. So we would stay in the room, and as soon as whatever could be of security risk to someone was finished, he gave the thumbs up and we switched on the cameras. Also, Chamisa's security team kind of embedded us in the sense that any information that they would have through intelligence about his safety, we would get also, because it would include our safety. So I don't remember too much about these days. I just remember it was hectic and we were on a kind of a survival mode. And I think sometimes when you work that way, you stop thinking and analyzing, you just do. You just go with the flow, what's possible. And that's what we did. And I think those days are actually some of the best scenes in the film. We didn't have time to look at rushes at night. We filmed the best we could, stored it on discs, got the discs off to safe places, made backup copies, and then, kept going. And also my cameraman, I'd like to mention Henrik Ibsen, who is tirelessly working from 4 or 5 in the morning till very late at night in also a filming environment where often there is no electricity. I mean, how do you charge your batteries or unload your carts in a place where there's not often electricity? On top of working in a dictatorship with an opposition candidate, that made this possibly the most crazy filming experience I ever had. And I think it wasn't until we finished filming and I came back to Copenhagen and I started to look at what happened in those crucial days just around the election that I realized the kind of material that we had.
Today is a day of mourning. Mourning over democracy. It is a black day. These guys are making Mugabe look like a saint.
These are all shots.
So we put up the camera and we were getting ready to film the press conference. And suddenly, 50 riot-clad police came marching through the hotel lobby and kicked us all out. All the international journalists, the polling agents, whoever was there, were threatened with sticks. And there was a huge chaos. And we kept filming because we realized that when our cameras was rolling, they actually just pretended to hit us, but they didn't really hit us. And when we realized that, CNN was there, Al Jazeera was there, everybody was there. I mean, all major international news. I'm sure Japanese television was there, several channels. And so we realized that when we filmed them attacking us, they didn't actually attack us. They just threatened to attack us. And so I think this scenario is something as a filmmaker I'll never forget. Our cameras in a way became a weapon that protected us from being beaten up by the riot police. And I think at the same moment that we were realizing, hey, if we keep documenting, they won't beat us, I think the police realized, okay, we just declared ourselves a newborn democracy. Maybe it's not the smartest idea to beat up the international journalists in front of their rolling cameras. And so there was this kind of weird dance in the garden where they stopped beating and we kept filming. And then we paused for a second and then we kind of walked them out of the hotel garden. It ended up in a big mayhem out on the street outside the garden. The Ministry of Information came and said, stop, stop, stop. Of course you have the press conference. We're very sorry. For me, that was the quintessential situation of what was happening in Zimbabwe. I think it takes a lot of trust for a young opposition candidate inside a dictatorship to trust a foreigner like me to come up this close and film everything that happens. And I think that's the intimacy that you experience in the film. And I think it's credit to him that he led us in the way that he did, that we could capture those very critical, very sensitive moments that makes the film. Also due to a great network that I had created making Democrats, with local journalists, with a lot of Zimbabweans, we got a lot of help and we couldn't have made the film without this village of helpers in Zimbabwe.
Change is coming, and change is coming. It cannot be denied.
Those who believe in change,